story actually begins long before that day, back in 1938. On a piece of farmland just south of Mount Gambier, a grazing horse stumbled into a hole barely wider than a dinner plate. It was a 1-foot opening, invisible from a distance, and no one suspected it led to anything deeper than a rabbit warren. But as it turned out, that hole was the entrance to an enormous limestone sinkhole, a perfectly preserved subterranean lake with crystalline visibility and water so clear it gave the illusion of floating in air. Once the hole was widened enough to allow access, divers began exploring what lay below. A chamber 460 feet long and 260 feet wide, with the surface of the water about 23 feet below the rim. Directly beneath the narrow entrance, a massive rock pile sloped down into the darkness, a cone of collapsed limestone reaching a depth of 131 feet. For most divers, the rock pile was the end of the road. Beyond that, the cave sloped downward, narrower and darker, branching into 2 deep tunnels, one to the east, descending 407 feet, and another northwest at 260 feet. The further one went, the more unstable and disorienting the environment became. The deeper tunnels were filled with loose silt and limestone rubble, and the moment a fin stirred the bottom, the water became a thick soup of mud and debris. To complicate things further, the cave offered no easy entry. Everything and everyone had to be lowered down by hoist one at a time. This wasn't a place for casual divers, and yet, by the 1970s, it had become a place of legend. That May, a group of 9 divers made their way to the shaft. They had done this before. They weren't strangers to sinkhole diving, and they had already conducted a successful exploratory dive just 1 day prior. On May 27th, they descended to the rock pile, fixed a shot line, and explored the perimeter. Everything had gone smoothly. They surfaced, feeling confident, and prepared their gear for the main dive the following morning. On May 28th, the conditions were good. The sun was up, the gear was packed, and the entrance, that bright shaft of sunlight cutting through the narrow mouth of the cave, was calling. Joan Harper, one of the team members, opted to stay above. She set up camp near the edge and started making hot soup for the others, planning to help with gear and logistics from the surface. She wouldn't dive that day. That decision would end up saving her life. The rest of the team, 8 divers, suited up. Stephen and Christine Millott, Glenn Millott, Larry Reynolds, Gordon Roberts, Peter Burr, John Bockerman, Robert Smith. They'd filled their air cylinders at Mount Gambier early that morning. The plan was simple: descend to the rock pile, stick to the perimeter, explore briefly, and resurface. No one intended to push past the edge. No one planned to go deeper, but plans have a way of shifting once you're 150 feet underwater. From the beginning, things were already off. The group didn't assign formal dive partners, a major red flag in any underwater operation, especially one this dangerous. There were no staging tanks clipped to the guideline, which meant no backup air if someone ran low. Worse still, the guideline itself didn't reach all the way to the cave floor. Each of those safety measures, if used properly, might have made a difference. But in the moment, no one seemed concerned. The water was clear. The visibility was perfect. And with so many previous dives under their belts, confidence was running high. The descent went smoothly. They reached the rock pile without issue. But this time, they didn't just circle its edge. They moved past it, past the known, past the line, and into the dark. Robert Smith was the first to feel it. He'd been to depths like this before, but even he wasn't immune to the effects of nitrogen narcosis, a condition caused by breathing high-pressure nitrogen at depth. It clouds the mind, slows reaction time, and can create a dangerous sense of euphoria. Divers often describe it as feeling drunk or drowsy. At 180 feet down, Smith realized he was slipping. His vision was narrowing. His thoughts were fuzzy. He signaled to the others that he was heading back to the rock pile. They nodded. They were going deeper. Smith hovered at the base of the rock pile, scanning the area for animal bones, something he'd hoped to collect, when a familiar light caught his eye. Glenn Millott was returning. Glenn had been watching his air and knew he was running low. On the way back, he spotted Christine. He tried to tap her to tell her it was time to turn around, but she drifted further ahead, unaware or unwilling to stop. Moments later, Glenn met Smith at the rock pile. The two began their slow ascent. By the time they broke the surface, Larry Reynolds had already returned. He looked shaken but intact. Only seconds later, Peter Burr surfaced, nearly out of air. Now there were 4 divers accounted for, but 4 were still missing. Glenn didn't wait. He grabbed a spare tank and dropped back into the water. He pushed deeper, back to where the others had vanished. At 225 feet, visibility dropped to 0. The water was thick with silt. The narrow passageways of the cave were now blind corridors of black mud. There, in the gloom, he found a flashlight and camera. They belonged to Stephen Millett. But there was no sign of Stephen himself. Glenn waited, suspended in the blackness, before realizing he couldn't go further. He returned to the surface. An ambulance had arrived by then. Joan, still waiting near the edge, could tell something had gone terribly wrong. Peter Burr dove again, hoping to find one of them. Nothing. Then came the moment that haunted the survivors for the rest of their lives. Both Reynolds and Smith, still at the surface, saw 2 beams of light moving in the water below. Christine Millott and Gordon Roberts. They were coming back up, but instead of retracing their path along the slope, they swam directly upward, likely thinking they could reach the surface faster. But what they didn't know, or couldn't see, was that they were heading into a dome in the ceiling, a dead end. They vanished into the cavity. The lights moved frantically, scanning the walls. And then, silence. Gordon appeared at the edge of the dome, looked back toward Reynolds and shook his head. They were lost. Christine and Gordon's lights flickered for a few more seconds, and then went out. John Bockerman was the last to be seen. One diver watched as he swam further downward, deeper into the cave, his movements strong, purposeful. There's a horrifying clarity to that kind of moment. He likely had no idea he was swimming to his death. Nitrogen narcosis can play cruel tricks on the brain. What might have felt like direction or determination was more likely a haze of confusion. By the time the search and recovery team arrived the next day, there was little hope anyone had survived. On May 29th, the South Australian Police Underwater Recovery Team conducted a dive to 200 feet. It was short and unsuccessful. They were underprepared for the depths and complexities of the cave. Their equipment and training hadn't been designed for an environment like the shaft. The next day, they tried again, still no bodies. Realizing the scale of what they were facing, the team requested support and began planning for extended training with the Navy. It would be months before they could return, but the cave remained quiet, still, and full. In January of the following year, a film crew arrived to document cave diving in the region. They'd already filmed in several other local sites and had gotten permission to include the shaft in their project. On January 22, 1974, they descended with powerful lighting equipment, flooding the chamber with artificial daylight. At 50 feet, a diver saw something. 3 people were in front of him, but he could see 4 shadows. It wasn't a trick of the light, it was a body. They surfaced immediately and reported what they'd found. Police divers returned the next morning and recovered the first of the missing, Stephen Millett. His torch and camera had been found at 225 feet. His body was at 50. No one knows how he ended up back near the surface, but there he was, under a ledge, wearing a buoyancy vest. Likely already unconscious or dead, drifting upward until trapped by the cavern's overhang. His position suggested a desperate attempt to ascend, a final push toward safety that fell just short. The water near the ledge had been calm, as though untouched since the moment he became still. Divers noted that his equipment remained intact, untouched by panic, as if his last moments had been quiet, or resigned. The vest had likely given him lift, but the cave ceiling had sealed his fate. There was something eerily peaceful about the scene, but peace doesn't erase tragedy. For the recovery team, it was a sobering reminder of how fast a confident dive can turn into a silent death. Stephen had been the first to return, but he wouldn't be the last. And for his loved ones, the discovery brought answers, but not closure. 2 months later, landowners, growing increasingly anxious about having bodies in the cave, approached a team of divers from Melbourne. At the same time, the police team was completing their extended training and was ready to return. On March 9, 1974, diver R.G. Traynor entered the water with his team. At 185 feet, he saw a figure, then another, directly beneath it. Christine Millott and Gordon Roberts, found exactly as they had been last seen. Together, below the ceiling dome, they had mistaken for an exit. The divers believed they had embraced in their final moments. 20 feet deeper, under a rock ledge, they spotted the fourth and final victim, John Bockerman. But by now, visibility had once again collapsed. Trainer was out of air and couldn't attempt a recovery. The sight of Christine and Gordon lying so close, frozen in the stillness of the water, was haunting. Their bodies had been undisturbed for months, untouched by time, perfectly preserved by the cold, silent depths. The dome they'd swum into offered no mercy, just a smooth, curving ceiling with no exit and no light. Their flashlights, long extinguished, were still clipped to their gear, lifeless as the air that had run out. Divers described a powerful stillness in that part of the cave, as if the water itself respected the dead. Gordon's hand was near Christine's shoulder, their final moments likely filled with panic and the hopeless search for an exit. There was no chaos in the scene, only a quiet, unbearable calm, the kind that comes after every breath is gone. The team didn't speak much on the way back to the surface. No words could compete with what they'd just witnessed. Even among professionals, it's rare to come face to face with death so intimate, so human, so absolute. They surfaced, knowing they would return, not just to recover the bodies, but to honor the lives lost in the darkness below. It would take 3 more days, multiple dives, and strategic planning to retrieve the bodies of Christine and Gordon. But Bockerman remained. His body was the most difficult to reach, deeper, in a confined space, and beyond what most divers could safely access. The team paused operations for a month to rest, recover, and plan. Then, on April 9, 1974, exactly 11 months and 11 days after the accident, they returned. And finally, they brought him home. John H. Bockerman's body had spent nearly a full year beneath the rock pile. He was the last to be found. His final resting place had been a narrow ledge, deep in the eastern slope, concealed beneath a curtain of silt and stone. Divers who reached him described the silence as overwhelming, as if the cave itself had been holding its breath for nearly a year. It took every bit of planning, every inch of line, and absolute trust in one another to bring him up. The water was colder at that depth, and the pressure played games with equipment and nerves alike. Even with advanced gear, they experienced the creeping fingers of narcosis, threatening to cloud judgment in the most critical moments. Communication had to be simple, sharp, and precise. A single misstep in that pitch-black void could have meant adding another name to the list of the lost. The divers worked in near-total darkness, guided only by their training, the faint beam of their lights, and a responsibility that weighed heavier than any tank on their backs. When they finally surfaced with John's body, the atmosphere was quiet. Not victorious, but solemn. A year of unanswered questions had finally ended, and the last soul from that ill-fated dive had been brought back to the light. The coroner's findings were devastating, but unsurprising. All 4 divers had died from lack of air. Drowning caused by hypoxia, simple, final, unforgiving. The investigation ruled out faulty air, mechanical failure, and physical trauma. No evidence of embolisms, no contaminants in the air, just 4 divers who went too far, stayed too long, and couldn't find their way back. Their gear was sound, their training was real. But the environment and their choices proved stronger. The shaft had taken them. The incident sent shockwaves through the Australian diving community. In response, authorities moved quickly. Within months, access to the shaft and other sinkholes in the region was restricted. The Cave Divers Association of Australia was formed to standardise training, qualifications, and safety procedures. From that point on, no one would be allowed to enter caves like the shaft without certification. It wasn't just a reaction, it was a reckoning. The South Australian Police Underwater Recovery Squad expanded their training. Equipment was upgraded, protocols were rewritten. This tragedy became a turning point for diving safety across the entire country. To this day, the 1973 Mount Gambier disaster remains one of the worst recreational cave diving incidents in history. And all these years later, it's still difficult to reconcile just how quickly and quietly things fell apart. 4 divers entered a cave with clear water, working gear, and experience. None of them came back. And what remains, after the funerals, after the headlines, after the search teams and recovery operations, is the quiet. A hole in the ground, a shaft of light, a silence so complete it feels like memory itself has been drowned. The shaft is still there today, still private land, still restricted access, still waiting, and it remembers. If this story moved you or made you think twice about the power of nature and the risk behind every adventure, help keep stories like this alive by subscribing and joining the conversation. There's more to explore and more to uncover, but always remember, curiosity is only safe when it's paired with caution. Thanks for watching.